Hello and welcome again. My name is Shannon and I'm the Chief Marketing Officer here at CyberCX. It's a pleasure again to welcome you to this very exciting event and webcast on managing cloud risk. Thanks for taking the time to be with us today, and apologies for those small technical challenges. We have a large number of registrants for this webcast today, which is fantastic and really does demonstrate the interest in this topic. The aim of the webcast is twofold today. Firstly, we'll be seeking to educate and advise. And secondly, we'll be looking to provide actionable insights to help you manage cyber and cloud risk. We'll also provide you with an opportunity to ask questions, so please use the question facility on the webcast. The agenda for today is to talk about cloud computing and how much of a transformative and really compelling technology it is for many organisations. It can increase speed to market. It can provide greater flexibility and can significantly enhance business agility. Cloud technologies provide many advantages over traditional technology approaches, but risk needs to be understood and carefully considered. Today, we will explore the rapid changes in the cloud space. We'll discuss how we gain trust in the cloud world. We'll cover off on risks. We'll talk about the concept of shared responsibilities, data locality, government regulations, and address some of the misconceptions that are commonly associated with cloud technologies. We'll finish by opening the session for questions, so do please use the question facility and lodge any of the questions that you may have as we go along. I'm going to start with a little bit about both CyberCX and also Microsoft. CyberCX is Australia's leading independent cybersecurity services company. The combined strength of CyberCX constitutes the nation's largest pure-play cybersecurity organisation, with a workforce of over 700 cyber professionals and a footprint across Australia and New Zealand, and also an international presence in Europe and the US. We provide a true end-to-end sovereign cybersecurity capability. Now, hopefully Microsoft doesn't need a great deal of introduction, but what I want to do today is share with you a couple of things about Microsoft that you may not be aware of. Every year, Microsoft invests over $1 billion in cybersecurity and security R&D. It supports 60 regions across the globe. It employs 3,500 security professionals within their cloud security operations alone. Their Cyber Defence Centre operation receives in excess of about 8 trillion threat signals per day across all cloud assets from Azure, Office 365, Skype, Bing, and others. And today we have two really outstanding guests. We have Mark Anderson to my right, and he is the National Security Officer for Microsoft. Mark is responsible for working with customers, partners, government, and industry regulators to ensure that Microsoft platforms are not only understood by policymakers, but also adhere to their security compliance and risk management requirements. In addition, Mark is accountable for the protected level assessment of Azure, Office 365, and Microsoft Dynamics. I guess we could refer to Mark as an industry veteran, having spent 25 years in the technology game. 15 of those years has been with Microsoft in various roles across the globe. So welcome, Mark. Simon Treadaway is the Director of the CyberCX Security Testing and Assurance Practice in the ACT. Simon has over 15 years of diverse experience in the information security industry, having worked at the Australian Signals Directorate, the Royal Australian Air Force, and more recently at CyberCX. Simon has extensive experience in cloud technologies and specialises in penetration testing and technical security assurance. Simon is also an information security registered assessor, or an IRAPper, and has performed the IRAP assessments for Microsoft over the last 5 years, including several visits to the Microsoft headquarters in Redmond. So thank you for joining us, Simon. So you're really in great hands today. If I can, I'm going to kick off the discussion today and maybe take a moment to discuss the proliferation of cloud services and what that means for businesses in terms of risk and security. And Mark, I'll turn to you for that particular topic.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Shannon. I think it's an interesting point, right? You know, when we consider the whole idea of where cloud services are today and the proliferation of them, I think we naturally tend to assume or go to the whole idea that we must be talking about virtual machines in an infrastructure as a service environment, or an Office 365 or a Xero or a Salesforce.com style SaaS environment. Yet, if we actually take a moment and think about the solutions that we run on premises, many of these now are actually becoming backed by cloud services. You know, that could be some form of advanced threat protection capability that sits on an endpoint. Yes, it has local capability, but that is normally extended by some form of cloud service, be that sandboxing or detonation capability or just additional analytics. And then another example would be, well, I have to use a PowerPoint reference, right? Because I'm from Microsoft. So think about something along the lines of in PowerPoint now, if I was presenting, it has the ability to not only transcribe what I'm saying, but also translate it to a different language. So again, that's calling out to the power of cloud services in order to do that translation for you. So when you think about it, cloud services really are becoming woven into the very fabric of business and IT operations. What that means, I guess, from a business risk and security standpoint, is that when these things are now becoming that part of our core part of the way our businesses operate, we need to think about the risk of those differently. And I'd say today, the biggest challenge that I see and we come across is that organizations, I think, tend to overestimate the risks of cloud, but underestimate their risk in the securing of cloud services. I'd say it's probably a generalized statement to make in that space. And we tend to find that we have a tendency to try and repeat what we've done in an on-premises world and take that to a cloud-based environment and hope that the things will work the same, which is a bit like trying to hammer a square peg in a round hole. If you hit it hard enough with a hammer, it will definitely go in, but it's going to get stuck and it's going to splinter, and that's going to be, really a point in time. So when you do that, you do end up leading to various suboptimal decisions, etc. And this ultimately, I'd say, comes from, I guess, a lack of understanding of cloud and cloud being completely different to an on-premises environment. We've all heard the phrase, cloud is just a computer in somebody else's data center. But when I think about that, it sort of makes me a little bit sad at times. It is funny, but it also makes me a little sad because I go, yeah, we've got these things called, processors, memory, and storage. But once we get beyond that as a core concept, everything else is different from the way the hardware is designed all the way up through software stacks, management, the whole works.
Oh, very good. Look, I think there's some really interesting points in that, and I think we'll come back to a few of them a little bit later on. Simon, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Shannon, firstly for the introduction, and to carry on where Mark sort of just left off, and to the point about it's just a computer in someone else's data center. I agree totally that there's so much more to that story than what that phrase emphasizes, right? And what I think is really, really fascinating as well is we're starting to see an uptick in the use of products like VMware Private Cloud and Azure Stack and things like that, where they're taking what you could get from the benefits of using a public cloud and deploying that in their own private air-gap network. You might see this in defense or other closed networks. I think those people and businesses needing to take on those technologies and to use them for their own internal networks and to benefit their business ultimately is a trend that we're going to see increase, which is testament to what the cloud brings in general in the public form. Another service that I think that flies underneath the radar quite a bit is banking and ultimately internet-based banking. All right, everyone on this call and the three of us all use internet-based banking day to day. It's quite an interesting concept because I don't think many of us think of it as a cloud service, but it probably does sit in that software as a service category, right? It's an essential service for every single one of us, all the organizations we work with. It collects, stores, analyzes data about us, and is ultimately the gateway to financial transactions, right? So businesses need it. And you could say, there's some risk in that space as well, right? So Shannon, you briefly touched on and gave a bit of history about myself, but I've been, I guess, in penetration testing or leading penetration testing teams for the last 10 years. I have obviously spent time doing some IRAP assessments in that more security consulting space, and that's where I've obviously met Mark and worked with Mark. And Mark made a comment earlier about time spent focusing on the risks that don't matter versus spending time working on the risks that do. And I think from all my years of experience and everything I've been exposed to, whether that be customers I work with directly or, customers through, relationships that I've had elsewhere, I would say that statement is fairly true, actually. And controversially, I think it's the thought process like Mark talked about, in that it's that on-premise or traditional thought process, and how do you change the thought, how you think about adopting the cloud, right? And for me, it's very much, there's two things really. And I think rather than focusing on those traditional on-premise network risks, we should be looking at, well, for starters, focusing more time on building an architecture that leverages the power of cloud services, right? And use cloud services to their fullest. And the second thing is really taking time and investing in understanding in that shared responsibility model, right? The shared responsibility model is a little bit more complex than it once was, and it's almost different for every single service. And it's not just Microsoft, talking about Amazon and Google as well, right? They each are going to have separate shared responsibility models for each of their individual services. And when you understand that, then you really do need to put trust in that cloud service provider to make sure they're doing their bits, and you just focus on yours.
Very good. That's fantastic. And look, you raise a number of really good points there, but I think one of the central ones is the issue of trust, right? And how important that is for various organisations. Mark, can I ask you, it's essential to cloud adoption across industry and across government. What are your views on trust?
Yeah, I think trust is exactly a key concept that you have to get your head around when you move to cloud. I think when you move to cloud, you end up relinquishing control of certain things. They're no longer in your purview. Except while you've relinquished control, you've not necessarily relinquished responsibility at an organizational level, right? You're still responsible for those things. And it's interesting, we use this word trust quite a lot. We just sort of throw it around. And last year, I did a little bit of research into it, because I think really around the definition of what is trust. I mean, we all know what the dictionary definition of trust is, but I actually thought, in an academic sense, I'm sure somebody's looked into this a little bit more deeply. And I found this great quote, which has stuck with me ever since, which is by a chap called Professor Jeffrey A. Simpson. He's a psychology professor at the University of Minnesota. And he had this phrase, or this quote, and I'm probably going to butcher it slightly, but he said, "Trust involves the juxtaposition of our loftiest hopes and dreams and our deepest and darkest fears," right? And although he's clearly talking about human trust in that context, I thought that's actually really apt when you think about it in a cloud context, because our loftiest hopes and dreams, if you like, are the things that we want, like flexibility to be able to deploy 1,000 servers like that, the ability to only pay for what we use, have the latest hardware, have the latest technology. But our deepest and darkest fears are the fact that we're no longer going to be able to control certain aspects of it, right? If you're responsible today for the physical security of your servers, you can go downstairs, walk into the basement of your building where maybe your data center is, see the flashing lights, feel the warmth of the servers on your skin, and feel that level of comfort that they're there. But if you were to do that in a cloud context, you'll just get one line that says, yeah, your servers are running, they're in the cloud, in a terminal or in a web page. So the question then becomes, like, how do you gain trust in a cloud world? We know how to do it in a human context. So like the three of us sat here now, I only met you a couple of months ago, right? But I've known Simon longer. Simon vouched for you, so therefore, I have a level of inherited trust. Depending on how today goes, depends on whether that trust level increases or not, right? So that's the whole idea of where I think we need to be heading to, is this whole idea that in the absence of being able to do that verification, you've got to put trust in third parties. So for example, CyberCX has been responsible for the Microsoft IRAP assessments. So really it's a question of, do you trust that CyberCX has cited the things on your behalf that you don't, as an end consumer, get to see? So that's probably one side of it. And then the other side of the coin is really when it comes to adopting cloud services, and Simon really touched on it a moment ago around the whole shared responsibility model. And again, I'm going to use a quote, actually probably a good quote from one of your very own Alistair McGivern.
Oh, very good.
Last year, CyberCX wrote a paper for Microsoft on assessing cloud risk, a nice, great 20-page, short, sharp, straight to the point. And Alistair wrote the foreword for that. And again, I'm probably going to butcher his quote, but to get to the point that he was making was that Cloud is not the same as outsourcing. You can't outsource risk in the same way you've always outsourced risk. It truly is a shared responsibility model, and understanding where those lines sit is absolutely key.
Okay, no, that's great, and I'm sure Alistair would be more than pleased to hear himself quoted back on these webinars. And look, Alistair does talk about shared responsibility and the shared responsibility model quite often, and particularly the need to understand that and cloud and how cloud risk is one of those elements that you really need to sort of get a handle on in terms of how that shared responsibility works, rather than just simply think you're going to be able to outsource it. Yeah. Simon, turning to you on that particular point, can you give us your view on security, I guess, of the cloud versus security in the cloud?
Yeah, certainly. And just to explain that for the audience that don't quite understand or haven't heard that term before, security of the cloud is, the Microsofts, the Amazons, the Googles. Security in the cloud is the consumers that are going to use that. Mm-hmm. The best way to give my view, I guess, is by what I see every day, right? And that is ultimately that there is still a gap between the two, right? The security in the cloud isn't quite up to the level of security of the cloud. And that's coming from my experience. So definitely sort of in the last 5 or 6 years in penetration testing, the amount of penetration testing engagements that we do that touch cloud services has increased and continues to increase, right? So I personally have probably been involved in hundreds of these penetration tests. CyberCX probably touches thousands. I'm just not involved in all of them. And I think what I've seen over the years is that those lines have never actually quite aligned with each other or met each other, but they have both increased and improved still, right? And I think the story behind that is we've seen an increase in services come into the cloud. We've seen increased education to the market, and then also the tools that are available to people and consumers of the cloud. And going back to what I have seen over the last few years, I would say the very, very vast majority of issues that we have detected have all been on the customer's implementation of the cloud, right? There is one instance I can recall where it was actually against the vendor themselves, and sorry, throw you under the bus, Mark, but this is actually a Microsoft issue and a server-side request forgery found in Teams. And again, for the listeners that don't know, server-side request forgery is essentially a way to proxy requests to internal services. But then, I guess, look, that was discovered.
I quite like this because you've actually raised a really good point, right? Yeah. Because if you think about security bugs, right, there's only 2 types. There's the ones you know about and the ones you don't know about. No software is ever going to be 100% security bug free. We'd all love to be able to get to that point. If that was the case, then we wouldn't all have jobs because there'd be no need. We'd all just go home. Everything's nice and secure. But you raise a really good point there, and I think if you think about, for example, the way the Australian Cybersecurity Centre has started to talk about risk now in a cloud context. In their latest Cloud Anatomy Assessment and Authorization document, they talk about the idea that when you're assessing a cloud provider from a risk perspective, don't just look at one aspect of it. You need to consider the cloud provider as a whole. So what you've just highlighted there is it's not always about going, we just need to stare at the security of this product. Yes, you do need to do that. It's part of it. But you want to look at the broader ecosystem component. So when Simon's team found that bug, was there a path that they could responsibly disclose it, escalate it, know it was going to be tracked, worked on, communication channels, et cetera? So like for us, it'd be the Microsoft Security Response Center, the bug bounty program, et cetera. Because if you don't have that maturity of ecosystem, the risk is that if you're working with a cloud provider and they don't take your bug seriously, probably just going to end up on a blog somewhere, right? And then all of a sudden it goes out to the Wild West and everybody gets to use it.
Straight onto Twitter, right?
Yeah, exactly. Straight onto Twitter.
No, you are right, though. And this was disclosed through the bug bounty program.
Yeah.
And touching on some of the common issues we see, and when we're doing these penetration tests, is just basic hygiene things, right? So we've got lack of MFA or open storage accounts or buckets. And even things such as secrets being committed to GitHub, right? And we'll be able to access that GitHub repository and get clear text credentials, essentially. I think What's important, though, is whether we're consumers or the regulators of cloud services or advisors for people that use them, we all need to be working together to tell the same story about how to adopt cloud and how to adopt it securely. And to credit these people, that there's a lot of work happening in this space, already. DTA, ACSC, the security community themselves, cloud vendors such as Microsoft, Amazon, Google, all doing phenomenal work. But if I go back right to your question, Shannon, I think there still is that gap, and there still isn't quite the alignment that we need to see between security of the cloud and security in the cloud. However, with all the work that's happening, it would be great to see this come to fruition and be closely aligned within the next few years.
Yeah, very good. And I might just throw to you, Mark, in terms of lines of responsibility and where do they sit?
Yeah, sure. I think the interesting point is that there's not new lines as such, but there's an element where I think we weren't quite looking at the full picture, to the point that Simon was making, that security of the cloud is really all about what does the cloud provider do for you, and go back to that trust model we talked about a moment ago. We'll roll back a little bit. You mentioned earlier, I've been at Microsoft 15 years, 16 years next month, actually. It's been a long time. So I've been at Microsoft since the whole cloud revolution thing kicked off. And I went away and did a little bit of searching through our intranet, and I found a great presentation that came out in 2010. And everyone's seen this picture before. In fact, it's been in textbooks. It's not just a Microsoft thing. But if you imagine the diagram is where you have all of the different layers, everything from networking, hypervisor, OS, all the way through to application. Application's a key one here. Imagine you've got that column with all those boxes. You copy and paste it 4 times. And under one of them, you write on-premises, then you write infrastructure, PaaS, and then SaaS. Everyone's seen this thing 1,000 times. And then what happens is, as you move from left to right, you color more of the boxes in to indicate that these are the responsibility of the cloud vendor. Now, the interesting part for that, and it's a little bit of probably an industry mea culpa moment, is that when you look at that, we stopped at application. There's 3 to 4 layers that sit above application: identity, access management, endpoints, and the governance of data, which are really all in that security in the cloud bucket, which fall into that responsibility zone. So for me, we need to sort of redraw those lines a little bit, or not necessarily redraw, just like see that what was on the rest of the page, because it was almost like at the top that we never actually quite got to. And if I think about what that means in terms of where we tend to see issues when people adopt cloud, I've been in the NSO role now just shy of 2 years, and I've probably almost got a perfect record in terms of when we have a customer that has a cyber incident, especially if we say like Office 365, we can map it back to those 3 to 4 layers that sit above on the responsibility matrix. So that's one part. I think the other part, just to finish on, is when we tend to talk about security of and in the cloud, it almost sounds like it's a little bit binary, a little bit it's us and then it's you. Of the cloud is definitely us. I mean, by all means, if you want to come and camp outside our data center and help secure it, you're more than welcome to, but we've got it covered. But when it comes to your responsibilities, even though we're saying identity, access, governance, they're all yours, there's definitely still a blending of responsibility back on the cloud provider to provide you the tools that you need in order to secure those components. Are we providing you the right levels of reporting? Are we giving you hints and tips as to, you've left this port open or whatever it is?
Oh, very good. So I guess I'll throw back to you again, Simon. You mentioned that you run the penetration testing activity out of Canberra, out of the ACT region. If you are going to go and test a consumer or a customer sort of cloud environment, so, say a Microsoft environment in this particular case, where do you start testing? Do you hammer Azure, Office 365? Do you go after new and innovative 0 days, or do you try something else?
Yeah, good question, Shannon. So we don't necessarily go straight after 0 days. Ultimately, as a penetration tester, you want the path of least resistance, right? And there's easier ways to start. But if we step back before I talk about the approach to that, we really see 2 different types of deployments in cloud. If I was to categorize them, yes, there's an element of gray in the middle, but we talk about this traditional or on-premise network. Ultimately, Azure, you can build VMs in there. You could lift and shift that network and push it straight into a virtual machine environment and just leave it at that. Nothing special there. And when it comes to penetration testing, that it is largely the same as what you'd do for an on-prem environment. So your normal external network, internal network, and application layer. However, things really get interesting when you see an organization that has adopted those cloud services to the fullest, and they're using different services, as SaaS, PaaS, IaaS in combination, and really start leveraging the cloud and for what it provides. This is great, by the way. We love to see this, but ultimately, what we do every time is, and this is very high level, by the way. There's a lot more detail that I'm missing out, but probably focus on 3 areas, right? And the first one is looking for misconfigurations in that service. So what we see quite a bit is manual deployments of cloud services and things like that, and that's where we jump in and we can detect that human error and they've configured a service incorrectly and access things we shouldn't and things like that. So yeah, we first off look for misconfigurations and that low-hanging fruit, path of least resistance, as I mentioned earlier. And then what we'll focus on is the bits that the customer brings to the table, or the consumer of the cloud services brings to the table. So if they've rolled their own appliance, or if they've deployed their own web application or things like that, that's where we'll look next. Microsoft, there's testament to what you guys have done with your software development lifecycle. I think that's and that whole application security piece is a industry that is still growing here in Australia, and not everyone is as mature as they should be. So going after those custom or bespoke elements of cloud solutions is where we focus next. Very rarely is going after the cloud itself, the Office 365 or the Exchange Online or the Azure portal requested by clients, right? I think Microsoft have demonstrated a fairly high maturity in this space with their bug bounty programs, with all the audits they undertake and everything like that. So that probably comes in third, but it's rarely required by the customer anyway.
Okay, no, very good. And that's sort of really interesting, because I guess, if you take your mind back to a few years ago, traditional sort of penetration testing was all around, how things are configured, what's missing, patching and the like. And now what you're sort of talking to is pivoting to more the misconfiguration of services that are currently already there.
Yeah, it's funny. I don't know if I mentioned it earlier or not, but we see some of the same issues or concepts of issues in the cloud that we did when we were on-prem, and cloud has continued that trend and hasn't stopped it, right?
Okay. No, very good. So look, before changing direction, and I do want to get to one of your favourite topics, Mark, and that's really based on a couple of things we've sort of talked about in the past. But can we get your view, your experiences in terms of what would be the few things that you would do and few things you'd tell anybody who's looking to manage their cloud risks? What are the key things that they should note?
Yeah, sure. I think it probably comes back to a few points that we made earlier around, the cloud is a different concept to on-premises. So if I was to bucket it, I'd probably put it in 3 buckets. The first one would be aware of legacy thinking. I'm not saying that all the skills that you have as an individual from a point of view of assessing risk, understanding security, et cetera, I'm not saying throw those skills away. What I'm saying is that when you move to the cloud, challenge your assumptions as to the why. Why do you think you need to do that control that you've always done on premises in the cloud? Do you actually need it or not? Or has the cloud taken care of that? Because conversely, it's actually the other way around. Things that were maybe less of an issue on premises could be amplified in a cloud environment. And I'll provide a couple of examples in a moment, because my next one would be about securing identity. We've heard this phrase, identity as the control plane when it comes to cloud. Network and network perimeters was very much the way we did things on premises. Yes, networks still apply in a cloud context, but for me, identity is the thing that holds all of this together. And there's 2 points on that. The first one is, again, I'll take it back to a legacy example, right? If you are taking your identity strategy from on-premises, let's say you've gone, everything's going to be a 6-character password, and you do 3 attempts at logging in and then we lock your account. If you were to take that policy, put it in a cloud environment, the easiest way for me to denial of service your environment is to guess that password 3 times from anywhere across the world. And all of a sudden, I could do that to all the accounts in your organization. You've just been denial of serviced. Yeah. So that's not that. So what that's saying is that's a legacy approach on premises. When you move to cloud, yes, you can't just sort of say, keep guessing all day long, when you have a password attack. But what it's saying is that there's different controls to how to think about how to mitigate that type of attack. The third one then is really along the lines of monitoring. Like monitoring is absolutely essential. And again, a little bit of a legacy thinking approach, right, is that the way that you monitor in the cloud, where you might be very network centric on premises, that's not really going to fly in a cloud context. You know, in an on-premises environment, you may have decided that, oh, for every network, I'm just making this up, every network segment, you've got it where there's a switch. We'll put a span port in the switch and plug an IDS into that. And that's the way we look for things that are going wrong. That doesn't really translate in a cloud model, right? So it's like, what controls or monitoring controls do you have that you can take advantage of? And monitoring is key because there's a lot of alerts and levels of detail that you can get in a cloud, but you've also got to make sure you're watching it as well. I mean, a good example, luckily it wasn't an Australian customer, it was a global customer where the Microsoft response team went in because the organization was breached. When they looked into the Azure portal and started to do their investigation, they went, yeah, you definitely have. You've been password sprayed. You've been password sprayed for the past 4 weeks at like 10,000 guesses a day. And we can see that because your entire portal is lit up like a Christmas tree. You weren't watching it. So it's that whole thing of monitoring is essential, but make sure that you are watching.
Absolutely. No, I think there's a cloud or otherwise. That's a great lesson to learn and to adhere to. So, what about you?
Yeah, look, I do agree with Mark's first two risks. They're absolutely front and center for me as well. My third one's a bit different though, and I go back to that shared responsibility and understanding that shared responsibility. I don't think we've quite grasped the concept of that quite yet. Mm-hmm. If I could just add to Mark's first 2 points though, with regards to, network versus identity controls, it is quite interesting, and you need to really get your head around it, right? So on that on-prem network, it'd be fair to say, and this is just a total guess, but fair to say that network-based controls such as firewall rules, access control lists, things like that, probably made up like 70% of your controls to stop access to certain areas of the network where it shouldn't be there, right? And then it was a much, lower amount, maybe like 30%, where it came back to identity, and that was, rolled in with Active Directory and things like that. In the cloud world, though, that almost flips over, right? So in the cloud takes identity first, and all the controls, that 70% is all about identity and access management and getting that correct. And the 30% is all about network-based controls. Don't get me wrong, you can deploy both very maturely in both environments, but it's just what you see most often, right? The cloud relies on identity. Which is quite interesting as well, because I think sometimes there's a negative perception with that as well, right? And it goes like, if you think, your database port shouldn't be exposed to the internet, right? That's the network-based control, that's fine. You can't even establish that TCP connection to that port. Whereas when it's an identity model, you are actually hitting the database service, and it's the identity that fails. So that happens at different layers of the OSI model. So the network-based controls happen at layer 3 and 4, and the identity is right up at layer 7, right? And I think the negative perception as to why the identity maybe isn't as secure is because to get up to the identity up at layer 7, you have to traverse all the other layers, which is ultimately increasing your attack surface and increasing the likelihood of something going wrong in one of those protocols somewhere along the way. And I guess this comes back to the, secure development life cycles and things like that to make sure that those elements are secure. So I've touched on it a fair bit anyway, but the third risk that I had was the shared responsibility and really truly understanding what you're responsible for in these cloud environments and understanding the differences between the services and how they operate. If we look at Microsoft Azure, for example, there's 160 services. I can't speak to how many would be in Amazon or Google, but you'd think the same, right? So that's a lot of services you have to comprehend, especially if you go down the multi-cloud path and using different technologies on each. There's quite a lot there to get your head around. And the risk for me is not spending that time to do that properly. If I move away from my own thoughts, though, for a second and talk to what I see, as has been mentioned, I'm in the ACT. I do a lot of work with federal government, and then I hear about a lot of stuff from other people too. I think there's three risks that are, I come across that aren't necessarily my own perception. The first being multi-cloud, and whether as a cloud consumer, I need to spin up a Microsoft and an Amazon cloud instance, for one for primary, one for secondary, backup, failover, all those sorts of things. Another one would be ownership of the cloud provider and the origin of that ownership. Are they owned in Australia or somewhere foreign? And the last one is that data sovereignty. So where's my data going to be stored? Where's my metadata going to be stored? Because they're two slightly different things as well.
Okay, that's great. And thanks, gentlemen, for those sort of pieces of advice. Let's move on to, I know this is, again, one of your favourite topics. So Simon's thankfully raised it, which is great, and that's about sovereignty.
Yeah.
And I know sovereignty has a number of meanings to a whole range of people, and I think it's been particularly in the spotlight in recent times around COVID and the challenges that has presented. But I'm talking specifically about data sovereignty here, and where that data is stored. Now, from a large hyperscale cloud provider such as Microsoft, what's your view on data sovereignty?
Yeah, when I saw this on the running list for the webinar, I thought, oh, this is going to be great, because this is one of these moments that there'll be folks watching that's going to absolutely split them into two separate camps, and it's mainly because my view on this absolutely challenged the norms and the way of thinking. But let me just roll back and give you a little bit of a story which sort of backs up where this is coming from. So I think we're just hitting the anniversary this week, aren't we? Of this is the time last year when we all really started to get locked down at home. And I can tell you that between March 2020 and about May, my diary was just absolutely smashed with calls with customers, because at this point, as organizations realized that they had to enact effectively a DR plan, the move to cloud became much more of a priority, if you like, for want of a better phrase. There was organizations that had done no cloud, and they were being told the only way we can do this is to move to cloud. And then there was organizations that were early on in their journey. Just as an interesting side point, I think it was an interesting test of DR, because I think we tend to traditionally have thought about DR as being, if we're all in building A and building A burns down, we all transfer and set up in building B. I don't think anybody ever thought about the idea of building A hasn't burnt down, but we need to disperse to everywhere else. It was almost like caught a few people out in terms of what DR plans actually look like. But going back to that whole, why was my diary filling up? Well, it was as organizations were trying to make that move, they quickly had to do a risk assessment. So they'd go for the basics being, where is my data stored being one of them. So one of the calls, or one of the primary ones that I used to get, was for organizations that were moving to Teams, because Teams is ultimately the technology that you need to use in the pandemic, right? It's all about video conferencing. So for those folks that have an Office 365 tenant in Australia, up until a couple of years ago, if you'd spun up a tenant for Teams, it would have actually arrived in Singapore, because there was no Teams capability in Australia. So these organizations that had spun up their tenants and found that they had their data sat in Singapore, but hadn't really deployed, they were then concerned about the locality of their data. So we get into a call about, we need to move our instance because we're concerned that our data is overseas. And when you ask that question of well, what is the concern? Two things came out. Number one is, it's not secure when it's overseas. And number two, it violates the Australian privacy principles. And I think this was an interesting point, right? Because I don't think we've ever really thought too deeply about what actual laws and regulations do govern overseas data. And I can tell you the Australian privacy principles does not prevent you from putting data overseas. To paraphrase it, it basically says, make sure that the location you're putting your data has controls that are equal to or stronger, and that you're not doing things like disclosure. And it's probably a topic that's sort of broader than just what we can do at Justice in the next few minutes. So that led me to have this conversation about the fact that ultimately data locality in a Microsoft cloud context is not a security control, it's a compliance control. Because the way we operate our data centers is globally identical. So really, you should be no more secure in the Singapore data center than you are in a Sydney data center. That's not to say, by the way, that we're not going to bring services to Australia. There's always, regulators are still catching up. And then there's this whole thing called latency as well when it comes to services.
No, very good, very good.
So,
Simon, I might,
I was going to say, so is it fair to say, Mark, that you have, and I think I've heard you mention it previously, that data locality is a compliance control, not a security control? Correct. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. So For the most part, I agree. There's elements of what you just talked about that I disagree with as well, Mark, and let me go through that. So I agree that it's a contentious issue. I do agree as well that it's largely a compliance-based control. We see that quite regularly. And I do agree totally that, a service deployed in the Microsoft Azure ecosystem in Singapore is identical here in Australia. There's no difference there. Where I disagree, though, is when we say it's not a security control. And I think in the context of, classified networks and things like that, I think it is and it has to be. We can't take that away. And maybe that's my defense background speaking, but, it's just ingrained in me that's the way it has to be, right? But ultimately, that is a edge case. It's by far not what I see most often, and I'm sure you would agree that most organizations out there should be able to adopt it regardless of where it is, right? And so you mentioned the Privacy Act and things like that. I'm not going to comment on that. I'm not a lawyer. I don't care for it either. So again, another story for another day. But if I can share my personal opinion, I guess, and get up on my soapbox for a little bit. So if we look at hyperscale cloud providers, and so I'm talking about the Amazons, the Googles, the Microsofts, they're global by design, right? That's what gives them their power. That's what makes them so appealing, because you can reach a worldwide audience by deploying services on there. There's huge amounts of benefits by using hyperscale cloud. We've talked about it quite a bit in this talk already. And I love to see organizations deploy and use the full suite of services provided by a hyperscale cloud provider. So talking about AI, machine learning, cognitive services, things like that, right? Infrastructure as code. It's really, really, really cool to see organizations adopt that. And not only that, but see the benefits they receive by employing such technologies, right? So what I don't like seeing, though, is when an organization doesn't adopt those technologies because they're worried about data locality, right? It worries me that some organizations out there aren't taking the time and, spending the time understanding the laws or policies that govern them to understand where their data needs to reside and how, and, is that even a thing? And what that ultimately could mean is that there's an organization out there that could do something awesome for society, right? Like something groundbreaking, taking us to the next step, in humanity, but isn't going to, because they're not adopting these technologies, right? They're trying to do it all themselves, and it's just not going to yield the same results. And almost this whole thing takes me back to something that you taught right when you become an information security consultant, right? Or should be taught, I should say, is that security is a business enabler. It shouldn't be a blocker in any way, shape, or form, right? So I think we need to look at ways that we can, allow the adoption of technology, regardless of where it is in the world, to achieve the business outcomes we need to.
No, very, very good, Simon. And I know you want to jump in there, Mark, so I might just throw to you again.
I'm going to paradoxically agree with your disagreement with me, right? In that, I love that phrase, data locality is not security control, it's compliance control, because it challenges norms and it also provokes a reaction. But yeah, you're absolutely right. In the small print brackets that sit after it, I would almost need to say, as Microsoft is a hyperscale provider, because that's the only one I can authoritatively talk about, and we're not talking about classified networks. You can't even put secret or top secret data in a public cloud today, regardless of where it's actually located, right? But I think the point is that through that statement, what we're trying to say is that from a security standpoint, if you're comfortable putting it in a Sydney data center, you should be comfortable putting it in a Singapore data center or a Parisian data center or a German data center, because the controls are identical. That's leaving aside the whole conversation around whether you've got laws or regulations that govern you, because that's a completely separate component of it. But to your point, I'm not a lawyer either. I do spend a lot of time with them, though, for exactly this topic. But there's not actually many laws that do govern data locality. I think the one that everybody knows is, the ATO has the Tax Act as a good example. And then most of the places that you do see data locality in, it tends to appear in regulators and what regulators have put out. But I'd say the interesting part of this is that because of that, goes back to that point I made earlier about the education component, and we need to really talk a little bit more about what cloud services do behind the scenes. like it still doesn't pass the pub test is probably my biggest issue, right? Is that, if I was to say to you, we were chatting in a pub and I was just say, hey, if you were to put your data in the cloud, is it more secure in Singapore? Is it more secure in, the US? Your answer is always going to be, Australia, right? You're never going to pick the country that's not the country that you're in. So there's still a lot of work to do in that area. And then I'd say the last point on this is that it goes back to that point you made a moment ago, Simon, which is that as part of when you are assessing cloud risk, you should really take the time to understand, are there rules and regs that you do actually need to abide by? And if you don't, then don't make them up to, because it will hold you back. And I found a really good example. When I go back to that example of March to May, we had this scenario where one of those organizations that needed to use Teams, their data was in Singapore. Now, this was a private sector organization that contracted work from a public sector organization. And if you looked at the two organizations in their own right, neither the public sector organization nor the private sector organization was under any form of law, rule, or regulation to store data locally. But for some reason, when they contracted with each other, they decided to write into the contract, data must be stored on shore. So it was clearly a moment where we just went, that sounds like it's a security control. It's going to make sure that our data doesn't get lost elsewhere, which in a traditional data center outsourcing scenario, completely agree. But what I'm saying is that the technology's moved on and it's a lot different.
No, that's very good. It's interesting when you raise the pub test, and I think intuitively, you talk to people and they say, "Where would you like to?" It's almost a tiered sort of infrastructure, a tiered sort of answer. Where would you like your data stored? Or like it stored onshore? Then the next tier is, well, if it's not onshore, then at least in sort of some Western democracy, governed by the rule of law and appropriate sort of controls, and then sort of elsewhere. So interesting sort of test that you can pass by people there. Let's move to the last section of the conversation, Simon. So we talked a little bit and we've sort of danced around regulation a little bit, and I'd like to sort of ask you your thoughts given your background. Have we got the balance of government regulation versus risk management right at the moment? Do we need to think or act a little bit differently when it comes to the cloud?
Yeah, look, I think we're definitely on the right path to getting it right. There's always room for improvement. There's always more that can be done. So we're definitely heading in the right way. When you talk about thinking about things differently, the advice I always give is embrace the trust and deploy as high up the stack as possible, right? So what I mean by that, and I touched on it earlier, is to trust the cloud service provider is doing their bits, right? Obviously, do due diligence and things like that. Choose a reputable cloud service provider, but don't stress about the things you can't control, right? And the second part of that is deploying as high up the stack as possible. And that goes back to what we were talking about earlier. Don't just deploy, the design of a traditional network in the Azure cloud. Use the services and at every single level to maximize your use of cloud, right? So, for example, if I needed to host a website, rather than deploy a virtual machine in Azure and then install IIS and then install my application on top of that, we could use like a Azure app service to deploy the app directly into that, right? And when we're doing that, there's 4 key benefits, right? So the first one is that you're trusting that CSP to do all the things behind the scenes, which is all automated anyway, right? They've got their response teams, everything like that, monitoring that. So that's a huge win. The second is that it severely limits your attack surface as well. So you're not having to worry about the operating system all the way up. It's just that application. And the other benefit for a business is it reduces the resource requirements, right? You don't have a system administrator there patching operating systems and deploying configurations. And lastly, it allows you to deploy with automation or infrastructure as code, right? And that's where the real power of the cloud comes in building out repeatable processes, removing that human element from those deployments and making sure it's squared away.
Okay, very good. Mark, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I completely agree with the points that Simon made there. That whole idea of, I think regulators should really talk a lot more about how do you deploy further up the stack to lower your risk as an organization, to that point of you don't want to have to take, if you don't have to take on the idea of patching the operating system, that should just be bread and butter that the cloud provider does for you and eliminates that risk. You should move further up the stack. I think that's a good one. But the one that I wanted to pick up on there was that whole idea of infrastructure as code at the end, right? I think going back to that whole idea of how we've traditionally thought about what we're expecting from when regulators and so forth come out and say, we want to see when you deploy, it needs to look like this. I think we almost need to move a little bit away from the idea of fixing ourselves to reference architectures, if you like, in the cloud world. Because apart from anything else, the technology changes so rapidly that the second you sort of press print on that architecture and you've got it nicely laid out on your desk, you can guarantee there'll be a new capability in there. I think what I'd like to see is more of a move to be more descriptive around and then use policy-based capabilities. So when you're talking about infrastructure as code, why can't we be better to deploy declarative policies that say, okay, so if you're deploying a database solution, regardless of the database type, you've got to make sure that any connections to it are encrypted, and you've got to make sure that the data at rest is encrypted. And maybe the data to it is, the TLS encryption is TLS 1.2. So we've put that in policy, and that policy then can be deployed over whatever tools the developer wants to use. Going back to, the point of you don't want to hold your developers back by going, thou shalt always use technology X. You want to give them that flex, but you want to put the guardrails around it. And I think also the other part of that is once you start to declare it in policy, is that policy has the ability to go backward looking. If we put it as a reference architecture, you build that, it'll go there and it'll stay like that forever. If all of a sudden we decide we need to make sure TLS 1.3 is everywhere, if we change that in policy, policy then goes away and says, yeah, we've done it here, but all of this has still not got 1.3 on it. So we can actually go back and look at it. So for me, they're probably the key ones.
Fantastic. Well, guys, thanks for that. That's been an incredibly interesting discussion so far. We're now going to throw to Q&A. So I think we've got a couple of questions that come through. I'm seeing one on screen now. So software supply chains are so important these days. How should cloud consumers think about cloud providers in respect to how they manage their software supply chains? So I might actually...
Yeah, sounds like mine.
Yeah.
I think it's a great question. And it goes back to actually, I think we made a point on this earlier when Simon talked about the bug bounty approach, right? Having a cloud provider that has a solid software supply chain, or even just supply chain, let's not even say software, it's supply chain all up, security policy, I think is absolutely key. And an interesting side note, an interesting little side story on this is it goes back to that whole idea of legacy thinking and how should we think differently about it. If I think back to probably about 6 or 7 months ago now, when an RFI and RFQ that came in to us that the field team had received, there was about 20 questions relating to security, and they sent it through to me, say, hey, can you help me out with these questions because I don't know what the answers are. So there's 20 questions in there about this organization that wants to move to cloud. Probably 6 to 8 of them were all questioning, when you have administrators on the Azure platform, do they have a password length of X? Do they get to change their password X amount number of days? Do they have complexity on it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And to me, that felt like a bunch of really wasted security questions, right? Those things, that's the basics. That's a ticket to the dance to deploying these types of solutions. But secondly, that they're attested to through multiple certifications and accreditations and so forth, everything from ISO to SOC to IRAP and everything else in between. What I'd really like to see is you come back and ask me and go, how do you ensure that you have security in your software supply chain? Do you map all your dependencies out when it comes to open source components in your software deployment? How can you ensure that when that device leaves that factory, which is maybe a sensitive device like, say, a HSM, how do you ensure that it gets from there to there securely? So for me, those are the types of questions that we need to start thinking about and asking cloud providers. And as a cloud industry, we probably need to be a little bit more proactive on answering them.
So less sort of binary old school questions and more, really difficult sort of under the covers type of questions.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. And just on that, I mean, absolutely ask those under the covers questions, but it's also worth noting that there'll be things that a cloud provider can be absolutely transparent in. And we want to be as transparent as possible because we want people to understand, and therefore they lower their perception of risk. But it's also important to note that there'll be some things that we won't talk about purely for, well, it could be intellectual property reasons, or it actually could just be like operational security. Like that example of if I told you exactly what all the security measures were from getting that device from there to there, I've basically just destroyed my OPSEC, right? But that's not to say we don't talk about it. That's where we go back to, like if we do our IRAP, Simon and his team come in and we will tell them how we do it. Okay. And then Simon can attest to that back out.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Mark. We might just jump in, and that's actually a nice sort of segue to what looks like being a very good question about for government customers. How, now that the CCSL is defunct, can you comment on risk being transferred from the ACSC to the agency? And again, Simon, I'll ask you to.
Yeah, sure. Super interesting question, this one, and probably a pretty quick one to answer. So even when there was a CCSL, ACSC weren't wearing that risk, right? They were certifying that it met a certain standard. It was then on the agencies to look at that certification report and identify the risks to them, and then they were the ones that were meant to accept that risk, right? So although ACSC have removed themselves from that process, it has and always will be the agencies that are accepting and taking on that risk when using cloud services.
Do you think that was a common misconception through government
Yeah,
circles?
absolutely. And it shows in that question being asked as well, right?
Okay.
It's still a common misconception today, even with the CCSL gone.
Okay.
It's just moved from ACSC onto the IRAPers now, right?
Okay.
IRAPers are earning that risk.
Very good. Very good. Look, we might just go to one more. I think we're probably out of time then, unfortunately. So look, we might have to move on. Thank you very much for attending today. I think it's been a really interesting and engaging session. So thank you again to Mark and Simon for attending. And thank you for those who have attended online through this webcast as well. I'd like to remind you that we will be running further webcasts in the weeks ahead. So please keep an eye out for those. And we will also be taking this recording and putting it onto our website and also our YouTube channel if you'd like to share it around or potentially look at it again. That's pretty much it from us. So hopefully those insights today have been worthwhile. And please do again join us for our next webcast on a topic that hopefully will be of as greater interest as today's was. So thanks again, Mark. Thanks again, Simon. And thanks again for our
Thanks for having me.
participants.